Sawyer wasn't the only one tempted to play with this. We'll see. Little did I know we were going to get a stewardship message out of what you described as a long and boring passage this morning. I would tend to agree with you, actually, and this is part of the things, whether you follow what historically we've done, basically the Revised Common Lectionary, and this year we've gone to something called the Narrative Lectionary. And just very briefly, the Narrative Lectionary, the concept is to take larger, longer segments of our sacred scriptures, rather than chop them up here, there, and everywhere, to try to give some consistency and some coherence and travel through different books of the Bible. It's almost like taking Sunday school or Christian education and worship and in some ways blending them together. So right now we're getting ready to enter into a series of weeks where we're looking at the book of Romans. And of course, where do you start with the story? You start at the beginning, or that long and boring section. Hence, I understand why you went the direction of going a stewardship route. I appreciate that. There are certain things what you don't talk about in polite company. At least some of us have been raised that way. Do we remember what those topics are? If you're going to go introduce yourself to someone, what things do you not talk about? Politics. That seems timely. Money. Nobody wants to say the other one out loud, so we'll just say it's a three-letter word, and it starts with an S, and it ends with an X, and we'll leave it at that. So thank you for bringing up that money portion. I'm going to go back and take into that long and boring text, where there's a lot there that's kind of boring. But in the 7th verse, Paul comes and says, "Grace and peace to you." If nothing else, and I could end the sermon here and say, now let's just go out and wish grace and peace upon everyone in the name of Jesus Christ and go enjoy the beautiful weather. I'm going to take a few more minutes. So to explain this long and boring passage and to set the story up a little bit, this is a letter that Paul is writing to a church that he's not established. This is one of these letters that Paul is writing to a church that was probably established decades before him. We've got other letters in our scriptures where he's checking in to see how things are going in churches he's basically planted. But the church in Rome is sort of different. See, Paul's looking to go to Rome to make it his new home base. He's looking to go to Rome from Jerusalem in order to be able to set out into some other lands, to continue to spread the good news of Jesus Christ to more people who had not yet heard it. But here's the thing about going into new territory, into a church that's already been established, into a church that someone else helped start. Paul's coming with still the same basic gospel message of Jesus Christ. But Paul's coming in with a bit more of an inclusive. And I know for some of us who wrestle with some of the issues when it comes to Paul, and I use the word inclusive, we're going, well, really, that guy? But we need to remember that Paul is the one that had come to loggerheads, if you will, come into confrontation with some of the other earlier followers when he wanted to continue to expand the gospel of Jesus Christ beyond the Jewish community and into the Gentile community, into those folks that weren't necessarily following the sacred scriptures as they had been raised with, but were the other, were the different. Paul came to disagreements with folks back in Jerusalem. And so as he's writing this letter to Rome saying, hey, this is me, you probably have heard about me. I'm on my way to you. And so the first thing he does is begin to commend them for some of the wonderful things that they have been doing. But then he also sets it up to say, from here, I hope that we can. See, in that letter, that long, boring passage that Gail read, it was very important that he let the community know, the community that he was coming to let them know who he was and what he hoped to achieve with them. My wife is the one that's ADD, but you put blocks in front of me and I don't know. I have to do something with them. So perhaps we come to where you went with it. And then to say the reality as we are in this time of transition, as we are in this time of getting ready to put a search profile together, as we are getting ready to discern who the next settled pastor is going to be to journey with you, there are important things for us to be able to start talking about. Money's one of them. Politics, I think we can probably continue just to keep off to the side, although I will say social justice issues are not the same as politics. Justice issues are those things that are part of who we are as people of faith, as followers of Jesus. And the S-E, I put the middle letter in there too, didn't I? That other word that we weren't going to necessarily politely talk about in the congregation sort of rears itself up in some of our conversations as well. More along the lines of who's allowed or who's invited into our midst, into our congregation, as we're discerning who you are. See, part of the search profile, the new search profile that we're going to be able to start working with, there are some 3 key areas and questions. Who have you been? Who are you now? And who is your neighbor? And within the context of who are you now, we start talking about where we are as a church financially, where we are as a church on what things we do in worship, what kind of things we do to reach out to the community. Those are all, if you want to look at it, and if we want to tie it to that long, boring, you know I'm going to keep picking on you. The phrase that you use is poking the bear. All right, it's fun to poke back. Back to that passage that we started with this morning. That means of introducing yourself. That's part of the introduction for your search profile. It's going to be important that all of us, whether you have been here since you were in diapers, when you got a little bit older and were tempted to, I'm not going to do it, whether you've been here for that long or whether you've just started to come here, whether you're just starting to return back, all of your voices, all of your thoughts, all of your ideas, all of who makes you you is needed as we discern who are we, who are you, as you get ready for that next step. So here's a very brief commercial to say no details yet, but over the course of the next couple months, we're going to have small group conversations. And if you're apt to not like to talk with other people about things, understand that. But the invitation is to each and every one of you to bring your voice into the conversation as we put ideas and thoughts onto paper, as we go into search. But then to be able to go back and to build off of, see what I did there? To build off of the children's moment. We don't just need thoughts and ideas and opinions, because part of that profile says, who are you as a congregation financially? That part of the reality of then, what can you afford, or who can you afford to call? And there's a reality check involved. It probably is not going to surprise any of you that this is not a congregation that it was 50 years ago or 75 years ago. This isn't even a congregation of who you were 10 years ago. And so in some ways you add that to the conversation of money and politics and that S word of sometimes things we're not comfortable talking about. But quite honestly, sometimes it's just the reality of the conversation that needs to take place. And it's not a disparaging conversation to have. It's just a reality of saying, this is who we are now. This is who God is calling us to be now. We build off of what has been from the generations before us. But we don't have to return back to try to recreate everything that the generations before us have been. We listen now for God's still speaking voice, and we deal with the realities of who we are so that we can, in a very healthy and faithful way, move forward into where we're being called. We're not exactly sure what that's going to look like. Hence your voices, your way of introducing. I said at the beginning of the service I enjoyed standing out on the steps and welcoming you as you came in. As you go out and you introduce yourself to the community. Chrissy, what is it you guys did this morning? I'm curious, with the awakening service, with this long, boring passage. Let me, for those of you who didn't hear, our awakening service this morning, where they tackled with this passage was, how would you go and introduce yourself out into the community as a church person, as someone who's an ambassador of, a member of, someone who attends here? That's a great question for us to be thinking about as we go forth this day. Who do you say, not only who Jesus is, who do you say this church is? How do you introduce a community to the gospel of Jesus Christ as it's being lived out here and now? Do we, as some churches do, I should have asked, is it okay if I move? As we introduce ourselves to the community, is that who we are? Are we a church that is about creating barriers and walls? And no, I'm not going politics. I said we don't say that in church. Do we create barriers between anyone who is seeking and God as we know God through Jesus? Or are we a church that when we invite others to come, to experience the unique thing that makes this church, are we a church that says we are here to tear barriers down, to open the understanding of God's grace and God's love, perhaps well beyond what has been understood before? Sort of like Paul did as he left Jerusalem and traveled to Rome. Paul started that letter saying, this is who I am. Perhaps you've heard of me. And here's where I'm hoping. Paul had expectations and hopes of using Rome to launch. Paul never got that opportunity. For those of you who don't know, Paul, as he lived into the gospel message, much like the one that he followed, was arrested and was put to death, living out the convictions that he believed. But that doesn't mean we don't stop trying. That doesn't mean we stop introducing ourselves. That doesn't mean we don't stop saying we know a Jesus who welcomed all, who broke bread with anyone that would break bread with him, who would drink with those that were despised and marginalized and pushed over and said that they were not clean or worthy or loved. It means we don't stop introducing ourselves and inviting other folks in to be part of who we are, even as we discern who we are. Bread broken, cup blessed. A community being called to discern